She braced for torture when he bought her, but this middle-aged human gave her freedom and love. Her name had been taken. Long before her voice, for 6 years silence had been her only defense, not the calm dignified silence of a priestess but the hollow quiet of someone who had screamed until her throat burned raw and then learned that even pain had limits. Her body remembered what her voice forgot. Every step was measured, every breath shallow. Her skin, once luminous, had dulled to the color of early frost, icy blue with the faintest hint of violet beneath. Her long black hair hung in jagged, uneven strands, the product of rough blades and careless hands. She stood barefoot on the slavers' D's, a leash looped around her throat trailing like a forgotten cable. Her frame was slight, malnourished, sunken, and yet there was no slump in her spine. She didn't move, she didn't blink. She had become very skilled at seeming like nothing at all. Docile, the auctioneer called out, flicking his data sheet to highlight the listing. Blue-kinned variant, linguistic strain, no known species match, silent for years, still fertile. Probably he laughed and the crowd laughed with him. She felt none of it, not rage, not shame, just the cold, anchoring weight of a moment too familiar, the weight of being watched and not seen. But one part of her still remembered how to listen. Cognitive decay possible, the auctioneer continued, tapping her collar. It chimed. Once her neural bands been scrambled, probably useless to anyone looking for an interface. But she doesn't bite, doesn't talk back. Dirt cheap, someone near the front spat. You could get better. Response from a bio cleaner, another voice amused. Cut her open, bet the bones are still fresh. The auctioneer lifted his shock baton and gave her a gentle prod at the side of her ribs. No response, not even a twitch. He tried again, a little harder. Still nothing. Inside her body was screaming, don't react, don't react, don't react. Every system she'd learned to suppress fear, flinch reflex, stayed coiled under the surface like sleeping wires. Her collar tingled faintly, but it didn't surge yet. Then the auctioneer sighed, starting bid 10 credits. Any takers? The crowd shifted, interest waned. This wasn't a gladiator, not even a good specimen for breeding houses, just another broken silent relic from a dead culture. Silence. 8, someone muttered. 6 to put her down clean. Another barked, and then 10. The voice was rough, low, and unexpected. It came from the back of the pit. Heads turned. Edgar Wren stepped forward from the shadows, coat dust streaked and hood drawn low. His gait was slow but deliberate, like someone who'd spent a lifetime walking through forgotten places. He didn't meet the crowd's eyes, he only looked at her, at the still silent figure on the D's. The auctioneer blinked. You serious? Edgar didn't repeat himself. He pulled out a thin, worn data chit, one of the old analog encoded kinds that couldn't be spoofed, and slotted it into the register. The collar chirped once, then turned green. Transfer complete. Sold, the auctioneer said, half laughing, to the museum fossil. A wave of jeers followed him as he stepped forward. Edgar ignored it. He was already focused on her, reading her like he would an artifact, a fragment of language not yet translated. As he approached, she tensed, not visibly, not to the untrained eye, but he always noticed her breath hitched just once. The pulse at her throat jumped. He reached out, not for her but for the collar's clasp, slow, deliberate, no sudden moves, and that was when she flinched. Not just flinched, recoiled. Her shoulders locked, spine bowed, knees bent like something bracing for a lash. Her fingers curled so tightly into her palms they left crescent moons in her skin. He didn't touch her, he let his hand fall. Come, he said, voice like gravel soaked in memory, and then he turned without waiting to see if she'd obey. She stood frozen, but her hunger for life, for motion, for a way, was older than fear. She followed. The shuttle was old, retrofitted from an agricultural hull. Its bulkhead panels still bore faded stencils from a grain fleet long dissolved. The interior was cramped, warm from residual solar bleed, and smelled faintly of ozone and dust. She curled in the far corner, spine against the wall, arms around her knees. Edgar didn't speak to her, not directly, but his voice murmured now and then, quiet and constant in Dreelan, the word for freedom and for getting share a route. I never liked that. He adjusted a navigation dial, blinking at the interface. Funny how language tells you who they used to be. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood the tone. He wasn't talking to Commander. He was talking to remember something. Kurth 9 drifted on the edge of forgotten space, a fringe moon orbiting a dead gas giant. Its surface was too cold for comfort, too warm to kill. The air was breathable with minor filtration. The Mining Corps had abandoned it after strip harvesting the crust for volatile ores. Now only salvagers, runaways and ghosts remained. Edgar's home was built into the remnants of a crashed orbital observatory. Old alloy hulls had been patched with insulation mesh and solar skins. The inside was dry and dim-warmed by converted geothermal vents. A low hum filled the space. Salvaged power cells cycling through their charge books, actual books, data pads, artifacts, dust. Rows of carefully labeled shelves, fragile relics placed like offerings on altars of memory. Her gaze swept the interior as they entered. No restraints, no cages, but what caught her eye, what made her hesitate, was the object resting on a steel slab near the far wall. A broken visor, its inner lens was lined with photonic threads, and etched across them faintly were symbols from her own language. She had never seen that dialect outside the temples. Edgar followed her gaze. That one came from Alaris, be bombed out before the registry ever catalogued it. Took me 3 months to piece those glyphs together. You recognize them? She said nothing, but something shifted in her eyes, something close to shock, and he saw it. He didn't press her. Instead he gestured toward a door. That room's yours. Water recyclers. Past the curtain, no locks. She stepped cautiously inside. A cot, a folded blanket, a data pad already lit with pictographic lessons. Her language interactive. The interface had been modified to account for memory loss. He had prepared this before today, not for a slave, for someone like her. Before she could make sense of the implications, he turned and left. She didn't sleep. She crouched on the cot, blanket untouched, eyes tracking the doorway. Her stomach cramped from emptiness, but she didn't touch the food pack he had left. Hunger was easier than betrayal. Still she listened. Beyond the curtain Edgar spoke to himself, or to no one. The word for truth in Lani syntax only exists in plural form, as if a single truth is never enough. She didn't know the language, but she understood the sadness. Eventually the silence returned, and then music. Not a song, just 4 cracked notes from an alien stringed instrument, out of tune, hesitant, but played like it mattered. When she finally reached for the food, her fingers shook. She tried to open the packet, quietly failed. Her breath caught, panic blooming, but no one came. She ate slowly, tasted salt, heat. Her eyes burned, not from spice, from memory. As the lights dimmed toward the simulated night cycle, Edgar passed by her door. He didn't stop, didn't look in. But he hesitated, and in that moment, just a second, he looked directly at her. Not her body, her. Then he nodded, slow and small, and kept walking. She sat frozen for a long time after he left, not because she feared he'd return, but because for the first time in years she didn't want him to. She'd learned to wake without moving. That habit had kept her alive in the pens where the softest sound could bring punishment, and the act of rising might earn you a lash. So now, as warm air filtered gently through the room, she let her eyes open in stillness. No motion, just breathed. The cot beneath her was alien in its softness. The blanket, unfolded and used, rested at the corner untouched. Her shawl had slipped in the night, and the artificial light above cast a pale amber glow across the floor. For a long while she didn't shift. The silence wasn't a trap yet, but it could become one. It always had. She hadn't meant to sleep. Sleep was trust, and trust had always bled, but her body had surrendered before her fear could resist. Her last memory before darkness had been the man's eyes, Edgar, and the way he hadn't looked at her like a thing that memory had lingered. Asleep took her, not pain, not force, just a nod and quiet. She drew in a breath, now slow. The air tasted clean, filtered, dry, faintly metallic. She could smell heat, steam, something cooking. A trick. Her stomach clenched. Hunger stirred like a whisper from inside a locked room. She rose quietly, tucking the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her feet touched the floor with the care of someone who'd been punished for walking too loud, and when she pulled the curtain back, she did it with the tension of prey stepping into open ground. The man was already up. He sat at a narrow table, sleeves rolled, head bent over something she didn't recognize, a relic, a puzzle of broken stone and flickering lines around him. The room hummed with the soft life of power cells and filtered air. He didn't look up, but he knew she was there. "There's tea," he said, voice low and even, "and food. It's safe." No command, no expectation, just a statement, the way someone might comment on the weather. She hesitated in the doorway, every nerve listening for deception. If she moved toward him, would he change? If she reached for the food, would it be poison? Or would her hunger be used as a leash the way it always had? He didn't rise, didn't watch her, just kept working. Her eyes scanned the table, 2 bowls, one untouched. She waited still. He didn't Speak her hunger one. She took 3 steps forward then froze when the floor creaked beneath her foot. A sharp breath caught in her throat. Habitual instant she waited for pain, none came. She reached the food station, lifted the lid. Warm, not heavily spiced, some humans like to taunt with flavors she couldn't stomach, but hearty, a broth, mushrooms, grains. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the bowl. She hadn't eaten warm food and she didn't know how long. The first sip hit like a blade to the chest. Her breath faltered, her eyes burned. She blinked hard, swallowing more than food. She tried not to look at him, but she noticed he still hadn't moved. This was a trick. It had to be a test. Warmth always meant punishment later, but nothing happened. She sat cautiously, bowl cradled in both hands. Only then did he speak again. Those glyphs on the data pad in your room, did you recognize them? She didn't answer. He glanced over, not pressing, just watching. I spent years trying to reconstruct them. Most records were erased, classified. The registry called your language a non-functional cultural remnant. I don't believe that. She stared into her bowl. He let the silence linger. Then you don't have to talk, but if you do I'll listen. I know what it's like to be catalogued and discarded. That last part hit differently. She looked up. His eyes weren't soft, but they weren't cold either. They were tired, like something had been worn down in him a long time ago and never rebuilt you. Her voice cracked. She flinched at the sound. The word had escaped before she meant it to. He blinked. She tried again. You read them? He nodded. Tried, didn't always get it right. Your language has multiplicity, layers of meaning stacked like mirrors. One symbol could mean hope, hunger, or home, depending on where you stand when you read it. A breath caught in her chest. He had read them. Her voice faltered again. My mother called them truth knots. He didn't react with surprise, only nodded. That fit. Silence stretched. Then she said it. The word had lived behind her teeth for years, hidden, dangerous, but it came now, hoarse and small. Talon. Edgar's eyes darkened. I've heard that before, he murmured in a collapsed archive on the 4th moon of Veltus. It was etched into a ceiling beam surrounded by burnt walls. I thought it meant origin. She shook her head. Number, not origin. Her words were shaky lips unused to forming them. It means where your soul returns when you are forgotten. A long pause followed and then he said it back, not perfectly but with care. Talon. Her throat ached. He hadn't misused it. He hadn't claimed it. He'd heard it, and somehow that hurt more than cruelty. Because she'd prepared for cruelty. She knew what to do with pain, but recognition she didn't know what to do with that. She lowered her head, bowl trembling in her grip. He rose slowly and walked to the relic on the table. He lifted it, a shard of obsidian etched with old lines she knew weren't human, and placed it in front of her. I don't know what this means, he said, but I think you do. Her fingers hovered over it. The lines were familiar, not just in form but in memory. One had been carved into the wall of her temple. Another had been drawn into her sister's palm before the soldiers came. She touched it in her body, remembered. A ripple ran through her fingers, not electricity, not energy, but the thrum of memory encoded in shape. A language made not of sounds but sensations. It's not a word, she whispered. It's a blessing. He didn't ask for its meaning. He only watched her, and for once she didn't feel like a specimen. She felt remembered. Later, as the light outside dimmed to the amber gray of dusk, he stepped to the sealed hatch at the edge of the dome and pulled on a weathered coat. I'm checking the west antenna array. Storm scarring the horizon. Want to come? She didn't answer, just stood, walked beside him. Outside the wind wasn't violent but sharp. Kurth 9's atmosphere carried chill with quiet insistence, whispering against the rocky plain. They walked not far, just beyond the dome where the antenna shimmered with faint light. He adjusted the array, muttering about feedback distortion. She wandered a few paces, boots crunching over the thin frost. Her eyes caught something half buried in the ground, metal. She crouched, brushed the dust away. It was a fragment, maybe from a satellite wing or drop beacon, but on it, faint and unmistakable, was a glyph, one of hers, etched, not burned. This place had seen her people before. She turned to Edgar. He raised a brow. You found something? She held it up. He stared, and then for the first time she saw it in his eyes, not just recognition, guilt. I thought this moon was uninhabited, he said quietly, but I found artifacts buried deep. The registry didn't listen. Her voice came stronger now. They never do. He took the piece gently from her hands, and in the dim silent twilight of a forgotten world something shifted between them. Not ownership, not obligation, but understanding. And she realized something terrifying. She didn't expect torture anymore. She expected to be seen, and that was even harder to survive. The wind had Calmed by morning, but the stillness that replaced it wasn't peace, it was the kind of silence that settles after a story's first truth has been spoken, the kind that waits inside the dome, the scent of sterilized clay and rehydrated root broth still lingered from the night before, the dishes remained untouched on the edge of the sink. Edgar had left them where they were, as if cleaning up too quickly might erase something fragile. She hadn't gone back to her room. Instead, she'd stayed near the artifact table beside the shard she'd found, the one etched with the glyph that had once been carved above her family's shrine. She sat with her legs folded beneath her and the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, not for warmth but for grounding. Her long black hair hung loose, now no longer matted or tied. She hadn't even noticed when she'd stopped hiding behind it. Across the dome Edgar moved with quiet purpose, not hurried, not watching her. He pulled open storage crates, shifting through salvaged parts, worn circuitry, fractured polyglass, broken sensor nodes. With every motion he gave her space while quietly allowing her to belong in it. She watched his hands. There was something precise in the way he worked, not just methodical but respectful. He never forced a fit, he never pried too hard. Even metal deserved to be handled with care. She spoke without warning. Do you have names? Edgar looked up. His face didn't show surprise, but the pause before his answer told her he hadn't expected her to initiate conversation. Not yet. We do, he said. Some given, some earned. She nodded slowly, then looked down at the shard in her lap. My name was taken, she said. They burned it from the record. She ran her fingers along the etched glyph again. The grooves were shallow now, weather-worn, but they still held memory, still held meaning. I had another name, she said quietly, the one they used in the pens. It wasn't mine, just a number, a mockery. Edgar didn't interrupt. She glanced at him. Her eyes, pale and reflective, shimmered in the low light like pools of starlight. I don't want it back, she said. Not the first name, it was a child's name. It belonged to someone who didn't know how the world really was. A long silence passed between them, then she asked without looking at him, can I choose a new one? Edgar sat down. The tool he was holding, his hands rested flat on the table, palms open. Yes, you can. She closed her eyes. There were names in her language that meant strength, names that meant rebirth, survival, vengeance, but none of them felt right. She didn't want to be remembered as something that endured because it had no choice. She wanted to mean something again. When she opened her eyes, she looked at the glyph and then back at Edgar. Sally, she said. It was soft-spoken with intention. He repeated it back carefully. Sally, she breathed out. It wasn't quite a smile, but the tension in her shoulders released just a little. Her new name had weight and it settled into her chest like something that belonged. What does it mean? Edgar asked gently. Sailory tilted her head. It's difficult. Closest in your words would be echo in still water. Something lost, returned, not always the same. He nodded. He understood later. That day Edgar invited her outside again. The light was sharp and silver this time, cutting across the rocky plains like broken glass. The storm had scrubbed the sky clear. For the first time she saw the ridge beyond the crash scar, the jagged remains of some forgotten orbital debris, its hull half consumed by frost and time. Edgar handed her a set of gloves. We'll need to reinforce the solar panels before next freeze. They don't like the high saturation winds. She took them, pulled them on slowly. The fabric was rough, but it fit. No chains, no commands, just a task shared. They worked in silence, side by side, not because there was nothing to say but because silence now carried different meanings. It wasn't fear, it was concentration, presence. When she scraped frost from one of the solar struts and found a symbol carved beneath a stylized loop resembling one from her sacred tongue, she touched it without thinking. Edgar saw yours, number older, she said, but familiar. He didn't ask more, but when they finished the repair and the dome lights surged back to full brightness, she didn't return to her cot. She followed him into the relic chamber. You knew, she said, back at the auction. You knew I was more than what they said. I suspected, he replied. Why risk it? He looked at her then, not like she was a mystery to solve but like she was a question he'd been asking himself for a long time. Because I've seen what happens when silence is mistaken for consent. When people stopped looking, her voice was quiet. You stopped looking too once. He didn't deny it. I did. Then why now? Because I couldn't live with not trying again. The honesty in that shook her more than kindness ever had. She didn't reach for him, but she stepped closer, close enough that when her hand brushed the edge of the relic table his knuckles touched hers for the briefest moment, not flinching, not bracing, just contact, and though she didn't say it aloud, the word echoed in her chest again: Sailory, not lost, not owned, chosen. And for the first time the name felt like armor she'd made herself. The relic chamber was quieter than usual, not the silence of avoidance, but of something being carefully uncovered, something not yet ready to be spoken aloud. Sailory sat on the floor beside the low sorting table, the threads of her long black hair pooling over her shoulder like ink in slow water. She wore Edgar's utility vest cinched with cord. Sleeves rolled to her elbows as she catalogued a fragmented ceremonial disc, the ancient carvings etched in a spiral pattern looked almost like language but said something older than speech, a memory, a ritual, a scar. Edgar sat across from her, polishing a ceramic shard with the edge of his sleeve. His posture was relaxed but his eyes tracked every movement she made. She didn't flinch from being watched anymore, not by him. The quiet between them had changed. It no longer pressed, it held some of these markings. Sailor said softly, tracing one with her stylus. They aren't just aesthetic, they were designed to resonate with sound. When the right tone is sung, the pattern responds, vibrates. A harmonic script? Edgar asked. She nodded. My people use them in healing. It's how the elders passed memory into the body through sound, vibration and breath. The knowledge wasn't just spoken, it was embedded. She felt quiet for a moment, eyes on the fractured edge of the relic. This one belonged to my mother's line. Edgar's voice was quiet. You're sure? Sailory didn't hesitate. The color, the way the spiral leans inward, not outward, and this symbol here, see it? She pointed. That was her branch's marker, worn only by those trained to recite ancestral law. He leaned closer respectfully. Did you learn that law? Some, she said, before they took the temple, before they decided knowledge was more dangerous than resistance. Her voice didn't shake, but something behind her eyes did. I tried not to remember her face. She added, it hurt too much, but now it's coming back. The way she held the relics, the way her voice sounded when she hummed during the night watch. Edgar didn't interrupt. He listened like someone reading scripture aloud in a ruined church. She used to say names were only powerful if you chose them. That's why she never gave me a temple name. She said I'd earn one of my own when I knew who I was. You have? Edgar said. Sailory looked at him. Have I? He nodded. Sailory wasn't the name they gave you, it's the one you gave yourself. That's the one that survived. Something tightened in her chest. She looked away, swallowing a sudden weight in her throat. I never told you, she said. What happened to my sister? Edgar's hands stilled. She was older, sharper than me. She used to braid my hair and mark my arms with chalk glyphs to protect me from forgetting. She said she refused to kneel when the hunters came. They took her first. I heard her scream. I never saw her again. Edgar inhaled slowly. I recited the loyalty script. Sal said I said the words they demanded. I didn't believe them, but I said them. She exhaled long and slow. I used to hate myself for surviving, thought it made me weak, a traitor. He met her eyes. You're not weak, you're here, and she's not, which means her story lives in you. Edgar said, and your survival is the vessel that carried it forward. Sally turned that thought over like a stone in her hand. Then she stood. Come with me. There's something I need to show you. He followed without question. She led him into the far wing of the dome where the older unfiltered light cast a warmer hue across the relic cases. There she stopped in front of a locked cabinet Edgar hadn't touched in months. I found this the first week, she said. Didn't open it. Didn't want to take anything, but I recognized what was inside. She keyed in a sequence on the panel. The lock released with a hiss. Inside was a heartwave, threadbare but intact. Its sea green strands gently coiled into the traditional dual loop pattern. Edgar stared. I thought it was ceremonial, he said. Didn't know what it meant. It means everything, Sailory replied. It's not jewelry, it's part of a bonding ritual. Two people place one loop around each other's wrists. They speak the blessing. It stays until the vow is done. Edgar looked at her. She was watching the weave, not him. I repaired it, she said. The threads were damaged but still remembered the pattern. She ran her fingers along its edge. I don't know what we are yet, she said. But I know what we're not. And what's that? She turned to him. We're not lost. Edgar nodded slowly, then stepped forward. He reached out, not for her but for the weave. When he took it into his hands, she didn't stop him. I won't ask for anything from you, he said, but I'll carry what you give. She hesitated, then stepped closer and gently took one loop and placed it around his wrist, then the other around hers. The weave settled between them. I don't know the whole Blessing, she said, but I remember the beginning. She looked into his eyes and spoke the ancient words in her own tongue, low and deliberate. We do not bind, we carry. Edgar said the response slowly, letting the rhythm find him, and we do not forget. The silence after wasn't hollow, it was whole. Later they sat together near the heater while wind stirred softly beyond the dome. Celery sipped from a shared mug, her legs tucked beneath her. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. Edgar turned his head. Of them? No, she said. Of myself? Of what? I remember. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead he lifted his own data pad and slid it across the table toward her. It was open to a document: proposed restoration codex pre-registry cultural languages. She blinked. You want to write this with you? He said. You correct me. I learn from you. Celery smiled, not politely, not faintly, genuinely. I accept. And when she reached for the pad, their fingers touched again. Not accident, not chance this time, it was choice. It started with a low distant tremor. A soft shudder rippled through the floor of the dome just after midday, rattling the base of the relic shelves. Sellers' fingers paused mid-symbol, her stylus hovering above the data pad surface. Edgar looked up from across the chamber, brows drawn tight. They both waited, then the vibration faded. Silence reclaimed the air. Edgar set his tools down. That wasn't atmospheric. Celery nodded once, the muscle in her jaw twitching. Seismic, she asked. He stood. No tectonic lines this close to the dome. I would have felt the buildup. He moved to the monitor by the entry hatch, fingers flying across the console. A moment later the exterior sensors lit up. Something just broke through the lower perimeter, he said. She rose without a word. The wind had shifted again, thinner now, tinged with static dust from the ridge, curled in spirals, twisting through the dry light. Karath 9 sky turned a dull silver gray, like bruised glass. Celery followed Edgar down the rocky slope toward the base of the western antenna array, where the soil had cracked around an embedded power node, and next to it something out of place, a dented sand-scoured beacon. Standard slave registry model active. Edgar crouched beside it, his breath tightening. Air stood still, eyes locked on the faint red pulse at the device's core. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Airing escapees, she said. Her voice was flat, but her shoulders had gone rigid. Edgar didn't look up. There's no official route through the system, no patrols. They must have had a report. Sari, I was already scanning the horizon. Her hands flexed at her sides, alert, ready. It was me, she said. I spoke my name, activated the glyphs. Someone heard it. Edgar turned to her, surprised. No one's listening to the old language anymore. Machines are. He didn't argue. Instead he lifted the beacon gently from the ground and crushed its signal plate underfoot. The device sparked once, then died. That won't stop them from coming, she said quietly. I know. They didn't speak again until they were halfway back to the dome, and even then only when the wind picked up hard enough to drown their footsteps. That night she sat by the solar kettle, knees pulled to her chest. Edgar moved around the dome with a kind of focused restlessness. He was scanning system logs, adjusting power lines, checking weapon locks on the outer hatch. They both knew what was happening, but neither said the word. Raiders, or worse, contract bounty teams who dealt in flesh and memory. Sailors' thoughts spun. Her instincts screamed at her to run, not because she believed she could escape. She'd seen what happened to those who tried, but because some habits never left you. She could still feel the pulse of collar shocks in her bones, could still hear the screams in holding tanks, still taste metal and dirt, but she didn't run. She stayed because this time she wasn't alone, and that terrified her even more. Edgar finally stopped moving and sat near her, not too close. His face was quiet, unreadable in the low amber light. The lines at the edges of his eyes looked deeper now, etched by worry, not age. You should sleep, he said. She didn't look at him. I won't, I can keep watch. She shook her head. I need to be awake if they come. His voice softened. We don't know that anyone's coming. You're wrong, she said. Her eyes flicked to him, sharp and clear. You think because you bought me I stopped being hunted? I never thought that, he replied. A beat passed. She let out a shaky breath. Then why did you bring me here? She asked. This wasn't curiosity, this was need, a desperate pull at the knot between them. Edgar didn't answer immediately. He stared at the stone floor for a long time, like the words were buried in it. Then finally, because I couldn't forget what I saw when I looked at you. She waited. I saw someone who had been made to disappear but hadn't, and I realized I'd spent years pretending that, just witnessing Something was enough that noticing it made it better. His voice lowered. It doesn't witnessing isn't saving. She turned her head slowly toward him and now she asked, I don't want to be a witness anymore. Her breath caught that answer cracked something open, not in anger, not in fear, but in sorrow, because for years she had hoped secretly, impossibly, that someone would say those words, not with pity, not with rescue, but with choice, and here he was. She reached out then, not boldly, not confidently, just enough for her hand to graze his. His hand didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it, the warmth, the realness, the terrible beauty of being touched and not owned. After a long silence he whispered, do you remember what it felt like before they took everything? She didn't answer at first. Then yes, but only in pieces. Which piece do you hold on to? My sister's voice. She called me Sharon. Edgar furrowed his brow. What does that mean? Sri smiled. It was faint but it was real. It means the part of the flame that doesn't burn you. He said nothing but his eyes glinted in the dim light like something unspoken had settled in him too. That night she didn't sleep in her cot. She curled up near the heater, blanket tucked under her chin, breath steady. Edgar stayed near the hatch, rifle in his lap, shoulders tense but calm. Outside the desert wind howled through the ravine, metal sang against rock, the cold scratched at the dome's outer hull, but inside for the first time in years she dreamed of voices without screams. And when her hand drifted toward his in her sleep he didn't flinch. The storm arrived at dawn, not with thunder but with silence so dense it felt like pressure on the skin. KTH9's upper stratosphere rippled in shifting tones of gray, silver and dust-swept bronze. Sailor stood by the dome's viewport, one hand braced against the frame, her eyes locked on the haze beyond. The desert had disappeared inside. The hum of containment shields pulsed steadily, low, warm, protective, but her thoughts pressed louder behind her. Edgar was assembling backup power cores on the floor, surrounded by cables and repurposed micro cells. His sleeves were rolled up, dust streaked his arms. He moved with practiced calm, but she could tell his mind wasn't on the wires. She hadn't spoken since the previous night, not because there was nothing to say, but because something inside her was unraveling in ways she didn't yet know how to name. Are you cold? He asked without looking up. No, she replied. She was, though not in her body, in her bones, in the places where old grief still lived, where no fire could reach. She turned back to the window. They'll come back, she said, maybe not today, maybe not this cycle, but they will. Edgar set a connector aside and sat back on his heels. They might, he said, and we'll be ready, but will I? Her voice was low. What if I'm not? He met her eyes. Then I'll stand in front of you until you are. Celery laughed, software bitter. You really would, wouldn't you? He shrugged. I'm not brave, just stubborn. She looked down, then back at him. Her hand found the edge of